Hello everyone and welcome for attending. My name is Thomas Dale MacLaine and we're going to do a talk about how to do an academic presentation. So what we're going to cover in this session, it's probably going to be about 40-45 minutes long. We'll cover what are academic presentations, why we do them, what makes a good and a bad presentation, and then I'll share with you the process that I have of how I design a presentation and then how I design the verbal component that goes alongside. And then I'll talk about tips and tricks to completing them. Throughout, I will share my personal experiences of them. Similar to my abstract talk that is available on recording, I love doing presentations. And I prefer presentations to abstracts. And the reason is I like the sound of my own voice. I like discussing the research that I've done. I like hearing other people's opinions. And I find them a really good way, and this is the most important point, I find them a really good way of connecting with others that have similar mentalities or similar concepts or alternative concepts that like to challenge others. And we can actually have an intellectual conversation about what it is that I'm spending a significant portion of my life looking at. So I think they're really valuable. However, you've just got to make sure you've got the time to do so. And you learn a lot of skills by doing this, actually, which are very translatable for the wider context. We can talk more about that a little bit later on. So academic conferences, they are in front of typically a wide audience who are interested in the work that you're doing or the area that you're working within. And a conference presentation should explicitly say who you are, what you do, and why people should care about what you're doing. And if you think about it as if you've spent, spent a year of your life, or 6 months, or even a couple of days of your life working on something, that time means a lot. And you need to convey in a short space of time what you've done, why you've done it, and the impact that's going to have on the wider community, on other researchers, on clinicians, on the public, Joe Blogs down the road, the government, policymakers. It can have quite a substantial impact. I think what's really important to consider, for example, is if you think about changes in the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of work has been done lobbying government on policies with evidence-based work. And one of the ways you would provide this evidence is through peer review publications. Another is through academic presentations of the research so that a wider audience can connect with the research, understand it in a better way that's more accessible than an academic publication. And then they can start turning those ideas into changes in policy. They are ways for you to communicate your research methodology or the results of your research to those others, and they're actually really fun to do. They can be daunting if you aren't a fan of public speaking, and in fact, I previously never liked public speaking, and it's only through doing conferences and presentations that I actually started to enjoy it. And we're going to look at one of the presentations that I've done a little bit later on, and I want you to critique it as harshly as possible and as kindly as possible. Give me a polar opinion about a good and a bad one, but we'll come to that in a second. So in the chat function, could you please write down why you think we might be doing academic presentations? So one of the first comments that's come through is incredibly important, and actually not one that I've got written down. So it's really important to identify that actually presenting your research and your findings in a conference presentation is actually a lot quicker than having it done in publication or in print. And I think that point is actually a fantastic, underrated point to be made, and it's fantastic. That's the first one that's come up. The second point that's come up on the chat is because the work is awesome and that you want everyone to hear about it. If you are working on a project that you believe in and that you know has so much value within the society that we're within, it's incredibly important to make sure that others know about it and feel your passion. It's important to disseminate and make sure other people are engaging with the results of your work. Specialty points or points for applications and other job applications, absolutely. So especially for clinicians who are going down training number routes a little bit after foundation years, there are points awarded for, and there's a lot of favour put upon those individuals who have presented locally, nationally or internationally. Those are the three we've got from the chat. We'll move on to looking at a couple more. So it's sharing your results and methods and making sure other people actually care about them. You're testing your research plan or results before you publish a paper is another one. So if you were, for example, about to start trying to put into a publication and submit a publication into a journal, you might want to do a presentation prior so that you can share your ideas and get a wider audience, and that way you're almost getting a peer review informally done prior to your submission. And after a bit of conversation after that presentation, you might find that you change the way you talk about certain data point, or you talk about the methods in a different way, or stress certain other data a bit higher than. You can present at a smaller conference, for example, in preparation for a larger one, so you can talk to a national group or even just a different lab and do a presentation there prior to then sharing that on a national level or international. You can just be simply reporting the findings of the paper that you've published. And certain places, if you, for example, are doing a presentation in let's say you're doing a medical education conference and you're going for AME, which is the Academic Medical Education Conference. They might be asking you to do a conference talk after you've submitted to their journal called Medical Teacher. It increases your standing on the topic. So, for example, if you are an early career researcher and you are interested in a particular topic, but don't have a lot of experience, if you're doing an academic presentation on what you have done or on your initial findings and where you hope to go, it says to the others that you are in this field, and it's almost saying that you are now a researcher in that topic, and it increases your networking opportunities at that conference and a little bit wider out. It states that you're a particular topic, so it means to a group of researchers, this is my domain and I'm the one that knows everything about this, or as much as the literature is willing to say about one small subject, and that means that others will come to you for guidance and advice. And then, as mentioned, they also account for application schemes. So we're going to come to a good talk and a bad talk. And what I'd like you to do now is initially write on the chat function what makes a good talk. Okay, so what makes a good talk? We've got a couple of comments coming in now. The first one is pitching at the correct level, so knowing your audience. I think this is incredibly advantageous to a good talk. If you are pitching at a level where you expect everyone to understand what it means to have done a phenomenological approach to a qualitative study, and to someone who has never done qualitative publications, most of what I've just said might not even make sense. So it's important to then pitch at a different level to say, I'm interested in what a person's understanding of the truth is. And it's really important that you pitch at the right level to get the engagement you require. Talks need to be engaging, memorable, targeted to the right level of audience, and therefore understandable. And I think memorable, again, is quite key here. So we've already talked about the engagement, but you need to make sure it stands out. So you want a person to then think, that person did that talk, well, that talk was done by that person. I need to go and see more of their work, or I need to go see more of them, and build on collaborations that way. Not just reading and sounding robotic. This is really disheartening if you are robotic within an international conference and someone leaves the room. It's disheartening to see, and sometimes it might be that it's because you're robotic. It might be that they've got a phone call or whatever. But if I've sat in a conference and I'm listening to someone robotic, I'll start disengaging from the conversation and I'll turn to Twitter, for example, and start looking at their work or looking at the posters nearby. And it's difficult for that individual to try and recapture the audience. So it needs to be memorable and it needs to not be robotic so that you maintain their engagement. The presenter actually having fun, I think that makes the world of difference. If you have someone who is so passionate that they can talk about their subject matter in a way that gets you engaged, but also so you can feel even the palpable tension that they have around a certain subject matter, it makes a substantial difference to your engagement, and you come away feeling impassioned about the subject as well. There's a question, is there usually a time limit? Often there is a time limit, so it's important to stick to the time limit. If you overrun by a minute, that's not very good etiquette, but it's tolerable because you're eating into your question and answer session. If your aim is to overrun by 10 minutes, you have lost the entire audience. The conference coordinators will stop your talk. You push everyone back and it makes it really difficult to engage with you later on. You would be identified as the person that cannot understand conference guidelines. So it's really important to make sure you're sticking to the guidelines that everyone else does. So we've talked about what makes a good talk, and a bit about the bad. Is there anything else anyone wants to share about what makes a bad talk? So not adding anything to the slides. If you're reading off them, if you are reading less than what is on the slides, that's a hideous waste of everyone's time. I also think a wall of text on a slide is impenetrable. Now, I've only ever seen a wall of text on a slide done well, and that's when an individual was trying to explain how chaotic it is where there are too many things happening at the same time, and it was an overlay of text. That's the only ever time I've seen text on a slide that's too cumbersome work. I think accessibility of the talk is also paramount. So if I'm presenting in an international conference and my size of the font is size 12, the person from the second row might see it, but the person from fourth backwards might not be able to actually read any of the text. And if you're reading verbatim, that might be fine for some, but again, there's no point going. And if they can't read it and understand the context or the data that you're talking about, or understand the graph that you're showing, again, that's a huge problem because you're not getting your message across to the people who are paying and are turning up and showing you the courtesy of listening to your science. What makes a bad talk? The vibe that this could have been an email, which is a very, very frustrating time. If a talk is going on for 10 minutes, you've donated 10 minutes to that person, and or a message, you've not only wasted that 10 minutes on someone who probably hasn't got the talk in a position where it's ready for consumption, but you could have also used that opportunity to prepare your talk, to visit someone else's talk that's running parallel, to get a break, those kind of things, and that's really important. Pace, absolutely, the pace needs to be on target. It can't be too fast and it can't be too slow. If it's too fast, people will lose the point, they will misunderstand, They might need to come to you for clarification, but it's more likely than not that they won't come to you because they're afraid that you'll make it inaccessible to them again in the first place, or in face-to-face, I should say. If it's too slow, then people are thinking either, are you thinking this through because you don't understand it, or do I actually have to sit here and watch paint dry through your voice? Can I now just leave? And you then tend to overrun as well. So really good points, fantastic. So what I would like you all to do now is have a little think about the bits you like and don't like in the talk. Feel free to write them down as you go or afterwards. It's a 3-minute talk that I have done, and I want you to be as critical and honest as you would like. This was a talk for a competition, and the feedback I received was very honest, so don't think you could beat them. And I really want to reassure you that this is okay. Write as much as you want down.
Next is Thomas MacLaine. Frailty, the fragile indicator of surgical outcomes.
Frailty. Frailty has been described in the Lancet as the most problematic aspect of population ageing. And as you'll all have heard in the media, we have an ageing population. Frailty, instead of being the chronological aging that we all know and celebrate, is the biological aging of a patient. And frailty is defined by an inability to return to baseline following a stressor. My PhD is interested in the stressor of surgery. Frailty is a monumental aspect that we all need to consider. If we take, for example, Falja Singh on the top right-hand side of the screen, retired from marathons at the young age of 104. I get out of breath saying the word marathon. My patients aged between 65 and 90 who are coming for surgery can sometimes struggle to climb a flight of stairs. Falja in the blue and a frail person in the right, undergoing surgery on this graph. A frail person already starts off at a lower baseline. During the surgical insult, the impact is greater and the patient has a more reliant care need. Postoperatively, it takes them longer to progress, to recover, and they establish a new hindered baseline, meaning that these patients are more likely to undergo postoperative complications, morbidity, mortality, and require additional support care such as nursing homes. Frailty is not identified routinely in hospitals. My PhD has identified that 32% of our surgical patients are frail, 66% of our patients are pre-frail, an intermediate stage, meaning that they're likely to become frail as a result of their surgery designed to improve their health. And this is a really big impact. So for colorectal cancer patients, they have a 6-week window of opportunity preoperatively. And what I've done is I've designed an intervention for frailty. Using 4 weeks of exercise training for 15 minutes a session, we can support our preoperative patients to increase muscle strength by up to 40%, which then can take that strength through to their recovery. Using quality improvement methodologies, I have also implemented frailty into routine care, using a collaborative that I've developed with colorectal surgeons, care of the elderly, anaesthetists, but also physiotherapists, nursing staff, and the pharmacists, so that we can sustainably identify patients coming into surgery, proactively tailor their care needs, and ensure that they have the social care, the medical care, and their loved ones there for the patients in their greatest time of need, where we're supporting them the most. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, so feel free to write down comments into the chat function here. I've had a few come through already, so good eye contact with the audience. I think that's a real telling point if someone's comfortable enough on their material to discuss openly in a public forum. If you aren't sharing eye contact, it means that you're trying to hide and you're trying to hide something. And often what you're trying to hide is that you are nervous or unsure or haven't got the confidence in order to be able to say categorically, this is my version of the truth, or this is what my data is saying, or this is how we've done it. Appropriate use of humour. Humour in a presentation is incredibly risky. If it doesn't go down well, you've lost your audience. If you think your joke is palatable and quick, you can try it, but make sure that when you try it on others before you do your presentation, so that your humour isn't in question. So, for example, my key point of that joke is that it doesn't matter what your age is per se as a number, but the condition more relates to how your body is in comparison to others. Not reading notes. I think that's a huge point as well. If you are reading notes, you can fumble, you tend to hold on, and you want to make sure you say certain things exactly as you've written them. And I've seen people come in with pages and pages of notes that they want to share during a presentation. And I think whilst that can be useful in a training situation, in an academic conference or an academic presentation, maybe not so. There's a few mistakes that were a little bit incorrect. So, for example, I said Fauja Singh here in the blue and a frail person here in the right. So listening back to that, that's something that I picked up on. There's a couple of other times where I said there was a 4-week training session where you would attend for 15 minutes per session, but I didn't say how many sessions you would do. There are little bits like that which were difficult. Looked comfortable, which made you feel comfortable. That's really good. Good to see a few critiques coming in, because that's really what I'm after as well. So at times gave you a little bit of a strange vibe in the sense of the first word being frailty, and said quite loudly actually. It was a little off-putting, and I agree. I think for this conference, the setting was that you would provide 3 minutes on what your research was, and you were lumped with every other group. So we had people doing mathematical equations to predict the severity of waves during certain natural instances. Then we had someone talking about looking through archives for certain parts of history. Another was looking at the impact that faith and religion have on modern day communities. So those are quite interesting. And I think the reason why frailty was used so explicitly was to try to tell you in one word what this talk was about. But I agree, it's off-putting. One comment is that there was too much time spent on the example, but it was a good use of the example. I agree. In a 3-minute window, you need to make sure that you're using a small amount of time to get the most points across, and too much of that time spent on the example. Hands were distracting at times. Fully agree. If there was a podium or anything, it's a little bit easier because you can hold onto the podium, you're in one location. There's no moving around, which is a positive, but because the hands are flying everywhere, you're more focused on what the hands are doing as opposed to what the content of the actual presentation is. It felt like a bit of a sales pitch. I think that is both good and bad if there's repetition. For an audience, if you're trying to get them to remember you, you either have something catchy, something they can hold on to like a joke, or repetition. So in a short time, you can use those, and they're sales pitches. So that's why it was involved in this. But I agree, in an academic conference that's a little bit longer, maybe don't have such a repetitive nature, maybe don't have that kind of sales pitch mentality. It's good that there was deep knowledge of the subject matter, absolutely. So make sure that you understand your data enough that you can talk about it confidently. and that visual aids would be useful, especially when giving statistics. Fully agree. In this presentation, we weren't allowed, we were only allowed one slide. But in almost all presentations that you give at conferences, you'll be provided, or you will create several slides to go into a presentation, and as part of that, you can then reflect on the data that's visually available. And a lot of people prefer to see the data than to hear you talk about it, because they can see facts and make up their own opinions as opposed to listen to yours. So we've talked about what makes a good talk and what makes a bad talk. So I'll just run through these again. So it needs to be clear and audible and appropriate verbal communication. It needs to be accurate and precise. So try to make as few mistakes as possible. I think that goes for itself, but don't be fumbling around. If you have made a mistake, address it and move on. Avoid jargon and non-medical language. I think I agreed with all of you when you were stating explicitly, don't read off the slides verbatim. Make sure they're accessible and clean, and a good tempo is incredibly important. I think the example used was also the tempo was probably a bit too quick. I'm not sure if others would agree, but personally, I think a little bit of a slower pace would have made it a bit more engaging. A bad talk, so waffling an unclear message, having it unstructured. If you're going from introduction to results to methods to results to methods to conclusion, that kind of structure or that jumping around gets very complicated. Inaccessible terms. So if I started talking about sarcopenia or a particular mTOR pathway, no one would understand unless I'd introduced them. So if you're going to start developing additional terms, make sure you introduce them by their definition and give the audience something they can hold on to. Too fast or too slow, and repetitive errors. So if I kept on saying in the right as opposed to in the red constantly, you would just get very frustrated. So how do I personally create a presentation? So you've seen a 3-minute presentation, which is an introduction. However, it's not a full academic presentation. And the process I follow is a guide for those who might want to use something similar, and then start developing your own process off the back of that. So what I find is that people have certain styles in their presentation technique. This is how I follow my own instinctive process to get to where I need to be able to deliver a presentation. However, you might want something different. The first thing I would do is I would get my specifications from whichever conference I'm presenting at. So I need to know what the time constraints are, what the format is. Is it 7 minutes plus 3 for question and answer? Is it 5 and 2? You know, what is it like? What terminology they require. So I would look at previous abstract and see if they prefer background or introduction, small things like that. Know your audience. So for example, that previous talk was delivered at a huge number of university academics, which is fantastic because they're all very clever individuals, but you have some from arts, some from other parts of humanities, you've got some from science and engineering. So they're all a bit different. So your terminology needs to be lower in terms of its difficulty to access. And also see if you can YouTube or go on Twitter to find videos of different or the same conference but in previous iterations. I find that a really useful way of understanding the format that they've previously followed, and it kind of gives you a template of what you're looking at. Moving on from that, I'd create a template structure. So in research, we typically follow the background, method, results, discussion, conclusion. In terms of a template for presentations, it tends to be your introduction, questions, methods, and by question, it's your research question, methods, results, and key results, and comments about those. So in your introduction, that's your background. Why Why do we care about the problem? The question is, what do we know and what do we not know? Where have we got to from the evidence that's available, and what are we questioning? Why is it important? Methods, how have you addressed the problem at hand? Results, what's come out of it? And your key results is your summary at the end to state that we found 32% of X, and that has an implication on Y. And the reason we're caring about this is because it acts on 1, 2, and 3. The next steps are X. So you can go through quite a lot of process just following that guideline or that flow. If you're doing a methods talk, so if you're, instead of presenting results early in your research and you're wanting to do a talk on what you're aiming to do and the methods you're using to do it, then I would follow a different pattern. So again, do your introduction, share the background research in the area and how you've come to your question. You can then share other approaches, and if they're not different to yours, just share your approach. Then you'd move on to the hypothesis. So we think that students at the University of Warwick have a very high chance of getting into their specialty applications. You do that, you would define your approach, and at the end you would again state what it is and why, and summarize that way. So after you've created your template, write down your key points for each slide. And I can't stress this enough. For me, I need to then take it onto a piece of paper. And I've taken 2 photos of my work, my lab work, so you can see what I tend to do. So if we look on the right-hand side of the image, this is a presentation called Shortcut, which is a research project that I worked on. First slide, I'm saying thank you to the organisers of the event, stating my name and the title of the presentation, and I've even said how long I want to ideally spend on that. And this is a little bit later on where I've actually planned to the time. Then the definition, the methods that you could do in your 3 statements about what your questions are, then what your methodology is, methodology again, and then finally results before going on to the last where I've said read the slide, which is the key points that I wanted to specify. And that's the only time where I read the slide. And I'm going to come back to this shortcut presentation a little bit later on. Just remember that I went through a lot of planning for these presentations. Again, the second presentation I did, you can see here introduction, definition, and why that matters. We then start getting on to a bit more about the questions behind it, and then we move on to the methods, then the results of the presentations, and then finally conclusion towards the end. So after I've got down key points for each of those slides, I then move on to add content to the slides, making sure I've used images throughout that are relevant, and signposting if appropriate. And by signposting, you'll have noticed in these talks that I'll tend to put a heading slide when I want you to do something, or if I want the audience to stop. And that's important because if you're then moving to methods, it might be you've spent a long time talking about other methodologies, and your heading slide then lets the audience know you're moving on to your methodology and why it's different. Fifth, go through your errors, go through your slides and look through as much as you can. Go back to the key points that you've put on your lab book or wherever you've written those down, and double check that each of the points that are on there map to what you put on your slides. So you'll have seen the hash mark on my pages, and that lets me know I've done everything on that page, and you've done that. And then finally, edit if you think it's too long. So it's about 1 minute to 1.5 minutes per slide, roughly, though it might. So for example, a title slide might take 20 seconds, your results slide might take 2 minutes, but just be wary that if you've got 10 minutes, 10 slides is probably the ballpark you're aiming for. So how do I then move on to presenting a presentation? So this is different to how do I actually create one. So you'll have seen these. I do this before I've done my slides. So you get your key points and you review it away from your slides and make sure you know what you want to say. Now, before I move on, I'm going to tell you a personal anecdote about the shortcut presentation. This was at the British Journal of Surgery's presentation conferences in Dublin. So it's an international conference, and it was full of colorectal surgeons from all around the world. And I was presenting two presentations, one after the other. The first one went well. The second one, the slides had a malfunction. And when I say malfunction, the only thing that was visible on each slide was the background and maybe one or two letters of the title. The content of the presentation wasn't there. The data wasn't there. All of the points from the presentation that I was trying to make wasn't there. And in this talk, I had 6 minutes to do the presentation with 2 minutes for questions. And that meant that I didn't have any time to change the slides. But because of this process and because of the key points and going through with preparation on this section here, I was able to then use that information and that preparation to do the presentation without the slides, including remembering some of the data that was really relevant for them to know. And this kind of process gets your back when you don't think anything else has. So it's really important that you follow something that helps you familiarize yourself with the data. So write your key points down, review, and make sure you know what you want to say on each point or each slide. Then start presenting to an empty room. Flesh out what you want to say and how you want to say it with no one around. And it gives you an opportunity not only to sound a bit weird talking to yourself in a room, but also to make the mess that you aren't prepared to do in front of other people. Sometimes I'll have caught myself saying something that's inappropriate or not necessarily relevant, or I want to leave for a little bit later for more impact. And when I've started to do that, I can then make a little note on my notebook to make that comment later on. I'll then move to presenting to a video or audio recording. And this, again, sounds a bit strange, but if you go through your recording, you can then spot parts that you want to improve on a bit better than you can if you're presented to an empty room. Make all of those edits before you move on, and when you're ready to do so, present it to other people in a safer space. And I say safer than being on your own, but less daunting than presenting to a brand new audience. Peers and supervisors are fantastic. If they know nothing about the subject matter, that's better. Try it as well in a lecture theatre if you're doing it in a lecture theatre. If you're doing an online presentation, do it there, and you become a lot more familiar. One of the issues with online presenting I was never familiar with, and when I started doing them again, it felt so alien that I just didn't feel right doing them, and it's taken me a while to be able to talk to a computer screen, knowing that there are people there but not being able to see them. So become familiar with your setting. I'm going to move on and show you a couple of others, but if you do have any other tips and tricks, write them in the comment box and I'll get to them in a second. So some of the ones that I've found are: know what your message is, make sure you've got a structure, don't start on a computer, make sure you've got your notepads and what have you to start on. Accessibility is it's a fantastic thing to continually think about, and it's a massive bugbear. So make sure your font is ideally 32 points if you've got a big room to work within. Communicate visually as well as verbally. So I was using my hands a bit too much in that 3-minute presentation. However, make sure you're connecting with the audience with a bit of body language as well if you're there. Make sure you know the slides inside out, and you get that way through rehearsing. Make sure you're running to time. Thank your funders at the end, organisers at the start, and your audience throughout. Run through the presentation as I've mentioned. If we then go to the first one here, making sure you're anticipating some questions from the audience. One of the things that a lot of people tend to do is have a few backup slides, and they have that after the thank you slide. So it might be that an audience member asks you a particular question around your data or your methodology. You might have an extra slide or two that explains a point, and that's afterwards. So you can then move on to the next slide or the next couple of slides to identify how to answer that question with the evidence there. And that is actually showing them not only are you skilled with the data set that you're sharing, but also you're prepared enough to answer them and you're professional in your approach. Technology being simple, I think this is really telling. I would recommend sticking to PowerPoint or Google Slides or this kind of presentation format. If you use Prezi, for example, these are interesting and quirky, but they can be inaccessible. So, for example, I've tried to use Prezi once as an academic resource, and people have said that it's made them feel seasick. They tend to retain information better in a process that's familiar, which is why we follow a structure. It's also why we follow a PowerPoint presentation quite nicely. I have a backup strategy, so my anecdote of everything going wrong, if there was a little bit more time, then I could have given them the memory stick again, which is where it came from, or I had it saved on a Google Drive, and I had my presentation uploaded into emails as well. So I had at least 3 methods of the same presentation being available. Get there early, scope out the room and equipment. For example, if you do a timed presentation, you might have the timer in front of you. We've talked about know your audience. Twitter, for me, is a godsend. I will always look at who else is interesting in a conference, see if they're on Twitter or LinkedIn or ResearchGate, and have a little look at what their material tends to be about. So I've got a better way to engage with them. And then finally, if you can, have a friend in the audience so that you can address the audience and know that someone's in there supporting you. So that's the presentation in its entirety. If you've got any questions, feel free to write them down in the chat. You can always tweet me, that's my Twitter handle in the middle, or send me an email. I'm more than happy to answer any of the questions.